All right, well, I might just welcome you all to the room today, today's webinar session. I hope you're all doing well. We have with us today Dr. Stephen Billett, who is a Professor of Adult and Vocational Education at Griffith University up in Brisbane. Stephen has researched and published in a variety of fields, including vocational and workplace learning. So we're very lucky to have him here with us today to present on transitions, changes and learning across working life. So without further ado, I might hand it over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Georgia, and welcome everybody. And it's great to have this opportunity to discuss this project with you. Thanks very much for ALA for sponsoring this event, but also I guess there's never been a more important time for us to consider adults learning than in the current era that we find ourselves. So how I'd like to progress is provide an overview of this project, then talk about transitions in working life, the kinds of learning that are required, and then considerations of lifelong learning and lifelong education, and then so what, and there will be time for discussion. So let's start somewhere with this project. So this project is about understanding further how working age Australians learning progresses and can best be supported across their working lives. And it's funded by the Australian Research Council through its Discovery scheme. The key focus of the work is to initially get some retrospective accounts from adults about their work-life histories, and then monitor that learning, or the learning of some of those people and others, longitudinally across a period of about 16 months. And we're engaging with native-born migrant, refugee migrants, both genders and different kinds of occupations. And also we're going to survey working age Australians across that period of 16 months as well to map the changes that are occurring. The team is fairly large. From Denmark, from Roskilde University in Denmark, Henning Salling Olsen. From Switzerland, Geneva, Laurent Filietes. Both Laurent and Henning bring particular experiences. Henning is a work-life history, and Laurent looks at the micro processes of learning in adult life. Then the team at Griffith, it's Rajni Choi and Ray Smith, and Leah Lee, who's the senior research assistant, and then a doctoral candidate, Dominika Ohana. And Dominica's going to look at the experiences of skilled female migrants. And then Debbie Bagali, who's a postdoc with us at the university, will take a particular focus on Indigenous adults and their learning experiences across working life. And then there's also Daryl Dimmick, who's provided great assistance in doing some of the interviews as well. So a large team. So the research question for this project is what personal, educational and workplace practices can best sustain employability across working life? So this project has 3 phases. The first phase is about identifying the processes and outcomes of work-life learning. And what we've done so far is that we've interviewed 30 informants. These people come from diverse occupational backgrounds, both genders, and we've engaged them in 2 interviews. Firstly is to do a retrospective work-life history interview, which is very open, and then engage with them to identify and press them on some details of the experiences they've had. And across these 30 individuals, we've captured 205 instances of work-life transitions. And we're going to try something new. I mean, one of the issues and one of the concerns for our field is that we do not have the kind and depth of data which is often attributed to understandings about children's development and learning. But here we're going to both gather qualitative data, but also use quantitative analysis of some of that qualitative data to identify patterns across the individuals who are working with and from whom we're gaining data. And we're going to then elaborate, as I said, this process of learning and learning support across a period of about 16 months. Now, essentially what's happened is we've had to change our plans because we find ourselves all in this unprecedented period. And there's going to be significant changes in the work lives of lots and lots of Australian adults. And so we're going to change the processes around to try and capture this and to utilize this experience to inform the project more fully. Essentially 30 informants, we will be mapping their changes across that period of time and also engaging in a survey of working age Australians, perhaps of a large number, perhaps 1,000 we hope, and we're going to do that on at least 3 occasions to map the transitions more broadly across the Australian working age population. And then the third phase is to advance policy implications of identifying what this means for education, workplace, and personal practices. And I guess you probably agree that this is likely to be very, very timely work. However, today I'm just reporting the findings from phase 1, those first 30 life history interviews. Let me start by introducing a couple of the participants. Salim. Salim was born in a Baha'i family in Iran. But after the 1979 revolution, he experienced religious persecution that restricted his education and also his work-life options. Essentially, he wasn't allowed to engage in paid work. And he faced perilous conscription. Essentially, people from his faith were being conscripted into the army and put on the front line in the war that Iran was having with Iraq. And it was essentially a death sentence. So he and his wife and child fled and came as refugees to Australia. He failed to have his university education recognised, and over the past 35 years, he worked through a range of jobs of working in factories, spare parts business, driving buses and taxis, before he gained skills in and became certified as a builder. And he worked in that field for some years before he had a back injury, which required him to identify alternative forms of work. He then went into a coffee shop franchise and sometimes returning to bus and taxi driving before selling that franchise and then becoming a project manager for a construction company. So Salim has experienced, that's obviously not his name, and that image obviously wasn't him, has experienced many transitions across his adult life, each requiring significant learning, not leaning as it said there, to progress. This includes becoming a husband and a parent during a period of religious persecution, which limited his education and his employment options, fleeing his country to establish a life in Australia, needing to become in English to participate in education and work, negotiating paid employment of different kinds across that period of time, becoming a builder, coffee shop franchisee, and then a project manager for a company, a building company. Shirley is in her early 50s and is currently a casual administrative worker. She was born with a learning disability and living in a part of Australia where educational support was limited. She struggled through primary and secondary school and completed her schooling with very limited literacy. Supported by her parents, she was found initial employment and then went on through doing vocational education courses to develop her occupational skills. Later, as an adult, she completed her tertiary preparation program, and that permitted her to go to university to be trained as a teacher. However, her teaching career was short. It wasn't successful and short. But she used the kind of literacy skills that she developed to seek employment in local government and had a number of roles within that. Yet she faced struggles and difficulties with some demanding aspects of her work roles that led to an early retirement from full-time work. So Shirley similarly has experienced a number of transitions across her working life, including becoming initially a retail worker, a beauty therapist, a receptionist, a high school teacher, a clerical worker, undertaking a range of roles within local government before retiring early, and is now a casual administrative worker. So why focus on these transitions? Well, these transitions require adults to negotiate them. And the greater the transition, the more significance to them, the greater the impact and the scope and depth of learning they require. And they provide a basis then for us to capture these processes of learnings and their outcomes and monitor the development of adults across a period of time, their working life. It's also fair to say that most of the accounts of development across the lifespan emphasize stages and whether and how transitions are negotiated by individuals. And some of those accounts emphasize maturation, maturity. And those who are familiar with Piaget, for instance, would know of the stages of Piagetian cognitive development. Others, which are probably more helpful for us as adult people interested in adult learning development, such as Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, all had a series of transitions that people had to move through and decide whether those transitions had been resolved effectively or otherwise. And then there is approaches which focus very much on personal factors, such as the life history approach to understanding adult development across the lifespan. Yet all of these seem relevant to understanding, informing considerations of adult learning across working life. That is maturation, social and societal factors, but also personal factors. So we're trying to bring these together. And all of this seems particularly important and pertinent in this era where new transitions have come up for people, new pathways to negotiate. And who would have thought that in February of this year, you would have highly paid workers such as, airline pilots who fly, 380s or 777s, now trying to find employment of any kind and considering engaging in retail work, for instance. So what we've found from the analysis of the first 30 interviews and these over 200 transitions is there's a range of changes that are occurring, and these play out differently for different individuals depending upon their circumstances. The first one is the change of life, maturation. So when people reach a certain age, their options might change, their needs might change, their needs to accommodate a family and care for them. The first dentist bill comes in is something which might change somebody's lifestyle when they become a parent, for instance, and realize the need to have steady employment. Then there's a change in employment status, promotion, demotion, a different kind of work that is being engaged with, as the example I've just mentioned. And there's also change in occupations. And what we've found, these changes are of three kinds. Firstly, that it could be about the person needing to change the occupation, or the occupation itself changes. Changes in the kind of skills and capacities required to undertake that occupation, and then changes in employment through restructuring and changed economic circumstances, such as just yesterday it was announced that Qantas will be outsourcing all of its baggage handling arrangements, and 2,500 workers will now have to renegotiate their work conditions with contractors. So that was just an example that came through on the news yesterday evening. And changes in location. So when people come to Australia from another country, there's significant challenges brought about by that. Or it could be people moving from one location within Australia to another, and the changes that that brings about. So for some, it's about learning a new language. For others, it's about understanding how particular cultural practices play out here, and those kind of changes. And then there's changes that rise in physical and psychological health and well-being. And we found there's two kinds of changes here. So personal health and well-being. And I've already given you two examples of that, of Salim having an injury to his back, which meant he had to change the kind of work he did. And then Shirley suffering issues associated with work-related stress, which caused her to have an early retirement. But there can also be changes in family health and well-being, which mean, for instance, that one of our subjects, Fariba, she was involved in, Felicia, beg your pardon, she was involved in doing a medical science degree, but she had 2 young children to care for, and there was no, at that time, there was no provision of, working remotely or studying remotely. You had to turn up. So she had to withdraw from that course. And then there's changes in, in personal and lifestyle. So individuals change their work. So one of our informants was working in the military and found that when the Gulf War occurred, there was clashes between their personal values and their faith and the kind of tasks that they were being asked to do, and that led them to leave the armed forces. And then changes in subjectivity, how we see ourselves. One of our subjects, Sarah, began her working life as a retail worker. As an adult, she did an adult entry into university to do social work. And there she encountered for the first time feminist ideas. And this changed her perspective on who she was as a person and her relationship with her partner. So a key change that arose from that change for her. Now, when we look across these, and this is using the quantitative data, we're able to see particular kinds of patterns. And across these 205 instances of the transitions we captured, we're able to see what plays out in most frequently. And here's those figures, you can see them, the high reporting of personal factors shaping and being impacted by these transitions, and then a strong focus on occupation. And I'm sure you can all appreciate that how those two are playing out at the moment as people are losing their work and having to find other work and reestablish themselves in a new occupation and how they view themselves. So issues of self are emphasized in this patterning. It's not just about the development of occupational skills, it's about who I am as a person and how do I interact with the world and engage with the world and how do I progress as an adult. What we've found is in these interviews is identified a range of different kinds of learning that occur. So language and literacy. So at one hand, it's somebody coming to Australia and needing to learn English. In another instance, it's people coming from English-speaking countries and needing to understand how language is used here and the ways it is used in both its spoken and written forms. So there's learning there. There's also the cultural practices associated with living in Australia, being part of that as it changes. And this is, again, very important for from migrants of different kinds, but also as changes occur in societal mores and practices, how do we make sense of that and how do we respond to it? Then there's the world of work and its the needs and requirements for paid employment, for being productive, punctual, reliable, problem solving, and the constant demands of changes which are coming from working life, and the needs to meet those to meet the needs of those whom we serve as clients, students, customers, patients, etc. And I think this extends to the understanding of different occupations and different career pathways and how people negotiate those in times of change as we are experiencing at the moment. And then there's work-life engagement, the degree by which and kind of ways that adults engage in their working life, and the degree by which it's a central part of what they are, what they do and who they are, or whether that's mitigated against other priorities. So one of the informants who hails from a Vietnamese heritage background, he views his family as being, and his commitment to family and his children as being far more important than the work he does or his identity in his occupation. And he sees work and occupational identity as being subordinate to being close to and engaging with his family. And then occupational skills, and that is the kind of skills that people need to actually enact occupation, or the ones that they're trying to develop to work in a particular occupation. So how all of this comes together is in this figure here, and I apologize if it's a little bit complicated. What you see across the top is a transition. And these are the range of factors that shape it. And on the left-hand side, you have the kind of factors that initiated the societal suggestion, which goes anything from somebody pointing a gun at you through to the demands of changing life and changing society. And then there's a brute fact of growing old, maturity, of aging. And then there's a personal driven factors. And then there's a series of changes, which I went through before, and how that then shapes the kind of learning and development that individuals do, the kinds of learning which I've just referred to, and the way that by engaging in, you both learn those, but then in learning them, they inform your development. And then down the bottom there is the kind of support that we're tabbed here as being lifelong education, and the different ways in which people's learning is supported. And that then leads to outcomes. The term there is ontogeny, which refers to our development across the life course, and also judgments about the degree by which the outcomes have been positive or negative for adults progressing through those transitions, and the degree by which those outcomes were intended or unintended. By the way, I should say that this entire PowerPoint will be available for all of you at the end of this session, so that there's a lot of material here, but the PowerPoint will be available. And so what does all this mean for lifelong learning and lifelong education? What the initial analysis suggests, and unsurprisingly, that much of the incremental learning that occurs between these significant transition arises through personal agency, engagement, and external support can be quite minimal or even unnecessary. This is often referred to as mimetic learning, individualized learning. The process down the bottom here, you'll see a definition of observation, imitation, and practice. And this includes trial and error, problem solving, and what the phrase which has often been used by our informants, winging it. So people just being able to use what they know to move to a position which is not dissimilar to what they've done before and giving it a go, as it were. Also, however, when a significant body of knowledge needs to be learned, such as that required for a new occupation, this won't be realized through discovery alone. And it requires access to and guidance in a domain of knowledge, albeit language or occupations. And it requires the learner to engage effortfully, and it requires support from outside of the person, from education, from family, from co-workers, etc. And what's come through is that, from the data, is that the importance of intentionality, the adults' focus and direction and trajectories being driven. Now, on the one hand, you have individuals such as one of our subjects called, our participants called Randall, who comes from Hong Kong and wanted to learn to be an optometrist, developed those skills, came to practice those skills effectively, and then that was his key goal, and to get Australian residency and to establish a chain of optometry businesses. But there were other directions that people took which weren't so linear. People took different approaches. Some people took time out to explore the world, to get out of work for a period of time, to find new ways and new understandings. So nevertheless, that was still quite purposeful. There was clear intent behind people taking those detours. And that, importantly, individuals' education across working life is a personally shaped, enacted, and mediated process. And the outcomes of that can only be judged by the individuals. It's only Salim who can really stand back and look at where he's come from to make a judgment about whether the last 35 years have led to success for him. And so I think we need to account for the continuities across these transitions and also discontinuities that occur. And this includes failures and lack of success, but importantly from the informant's perspectives. Now, one of the interesting findings, I think, is that in terms of securing these transitions, that, to foreshadow what I'm going to say, is lifelong education alone is not sufficient. That what we've found is that there's the person, the educational provision, but there's also something else often required. And we're tentatively referring to that as community. And that can be the support of family, ethnic or cultural affiliations, employers, opportunities that are arising, societal sentiments which support or inhibit a person's progress, or the sanctioning of something, gaining certification and award, etc., to practice. So I think this is important, and it refers to a sort of a system that isn't just premised upon the person working hard, but it's the educational provision that supports that. But there's also something else needs to come from that. Tentatively, we're referring to it as community. But to give an example, one of our informants, Sarah, who was working her way through an educational system, one day went to a seminar where she was receiving professional development from a group of people talking about dealing with classroom management issues, difficult students. And that evening, she took her dog for a walk and went to the local dog park, and then began talking to another person there. And she was saying she'd really like to do that kind of professional development work. And it just so happened the woman she was talking to was one of the people from that unit. She hadn't been one of the presenters. And that woman began talking to her and said to her, well, yeah, we've got a vacancy coming up in January, and you can guess the outcome. And yet, as as Debbie Bargelli, one of our colleagues, said to us, that she wondered whether how that situation would play out for an Indigenous woman, if an Indigenous woman walked in there, of whether the other person would engage in conversation and offer the same kind of advice. So I think what we're looking at here is it's the person, education provision, plus something else. And that's an area we're just investigating at the moment. So more than lifelong education provisions. So what? This is the last slide. So individuals' lifelong learning and are personally mediated as well as socially shaped and framed by brute facts such as maturity. And the adults will encounter and attempt to negotiate transition of different kinds and scopes and frequency across their working lives. It's interesting the number of different kinds of transitions that have occurred for our informants, but the number and scope and kinds of them are all quite different. And that the learning and development that occurs is mediated, as I said, by personal agency, intentionality, interdependently with what is afforded by educational provisions and these other contributions, which we're tagging as community at the moment. So some of the initial thinking here is that lifelong education provisions need to be cast broadly, and that is beyond the provision of educational programs where people are sitting down and being taught, to include a broader range of experiences which are inherently educational, i.e. those through work practices, in-house apprenticeship systems, and support and advice from others, family and other trusted sources. And that beyond individual agency and intentionality and educational provisions, what is afforded by the community in which adults engage, variously sanction, support and provide access to opportunities and augment adults' learning and development. And all of this seems particularly salient as working age Australians, governments, workplaces, tertiary education systems face the challenges of COVID, the era of COVID-19. So that's the end of the presentation. And now I'm opening up the chat box, and I can see there is a lot of comments. So I'm not quite sure, Georgia, how you'd like to proceed. Should I go back to stop sharing, or is that the best way forward?
I think now would be a good time, if anyone does have questions for Stephen, to pop them in the chat. I did flag one earlier from Deb while we wait for the questions to come in, Stephen. So Deb asked, did you find subjects engaged in thinking about their own learning ability?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me think. Their own learning ability. Many of the subjects with a particular focus were very directed towards achieving goals that were important for them. Let me give you two examples. So Salim, who I've introduced, he actively sought to improve his English, and he would take every opportunity to engage with people, to practice his English, but also to receive feedback from them on whether he was pronouncing words correctly, whether he was using the correct type of term. Salim's wife, who she was trying to develop a professional career as a salesperson in pharmaceutical, and she had, in the pharmaceutical sector, she had a strong background in science, strong background in laboratory work, but she didn't have any sales experience. She then went and organized a 9-month period of working in a shop simply to get retail experience, so that when she reapplied for the job to be a representative for a pharmaceutical company, she could tick the box of achieving those goals. So I think the answer is yes. However, it's also mediated by other factors, such as the amount of investment that's required. So Salim, for instance, he wasn't allowed to receive his degree from his university in Iran unless he converted to be a Muslim, and he refused to do that, so he wasn't able to get it. He was not able to get credit for his degree in Australia because he had no bits of paper. And he had the option of retaking an entire engineering degree, which would take him 3 or 4 years, I think. But he simply couldn't make that investment because he had a wife and a child to care for. So he took other options, to work in a factory, to organize a spare parts business, and then to do bus driving and taxi driving. So yeah, some of it is, I think, yes, active learning, but other parts of it are about making strategic decisions about whether that learning, the investment in that learning can achieve the kind of goals that the person requires. Okay, I don't know if that was helpful. Should I stop share now, and will I be able to see this screen? Oh yes, good. Okay.
So we've got one there from Jeff, just the most recent comment. Has thought been given to include in the study Defence Force personnel transitioning to civilian employment and or Defence Force personnel who have transitioned?
Yes, well, what's one of our participants in this project, and that wasn't intentional, Jeff, was somebody who worked in the RAAF for a period of time, a long period of time actually, and was a highly trained specialist. And what we've done is we've mapped his movement. One of his key transitions was from the armed forces into civilian life. And he, making that transition, had to go through the repertoire of his skills and find out what he could do that was transferable to civilian life. And one of the things he'd learned, because he used to drive, he was involved in radar, and he drove a mobile radar system, which was on a truck. And so he had a certain level of truck license, and he used that as the bridge to move into civilian life. And then other things happened for him in his career. He then began working for a large truck company selling trucks, and then actually involved in vehicle engineering within that company. So there was a bridge there that was based upon the skills he had that were applicable outside of that. In terms of what we're going to do in the second phase is, we're going to continue with some of the people from the first phase, but what we're keen to do is actually try and identify people who have been affected by the coronavirus, who now have to make significant career changes and follow them through. Now, and I'm very aware, Jeff, by the way, of how that can be quite a difficult transition for many people in the armed forces. Okay, Georgina, can you help me here a little bit?
Yep, so we've got a question from Rosemary. How were the project candidates selected?
Yes, I mean, initially you use a process of essentially it's people with whom you're aware from your community to start the process of, and we were able to get sufficient people from the range of contacts we had that were of a particular kind of diversity. When I had an earlier project that was of a different kind, I went on ABC radio and tried to encourage people from outside. Moving into the next phase, what we'll be looking for is to identify some particular people that have been impacted by the coronavirus. And our selection process there, Rosemary, will be far more focused, and we'll have to go and find people. And what we want to do also, and we think this is not part of what we've been paid to do, by the way, but we think it's important, to try and do a survey of about 1,000 Australians as working Australians as they negotiate this period. And though we're going to need some help because we need to reach out to people and get people to be involved in that survey. So in some sense, you could say, Rosemary, that the first sample became a convenient sample because we found the folk that we want. But in the second phase, we're probably going to have to do a lot more targeting work. Thank you.
So Gary asks, in what way does education funding, especially VET focused, assist the actual learning needs of adults throughout life?
To be honest with you, I don't think I'm informed enough to answer that question. We don't have data on that. We have people, for instance, the example I gave you where Salim simply wasn't in a position to undertake 3 years of full-time study in an engineering degree because he had to bring in income to feed his wife and children. So we haven't gathered data on that, and I mean, it's a good point. It's a good point. I mean, as people would be aware at the moment, there's a very hot debate upon the federal government imposing particular levels of fees on particular kinds of university courses, and we could talk about that, but that's highly problematic. One of the concerns I've got is that there'll be a lot of pressure on higher education courses in the next year. And I'm really worried that young people in particular not only won't get into the courses they want because occupational specific courses will be under a lot of pressure, but young people will be pressed into the kind of courses which the federal government intends to make the same cost as more than medicine. And often they're the kind of courses where young people can try and find out, what kind of direction they want to go in. But I simply don't really have the data to answer that question. It wasn't really part of the focus, but I know it's a very important question.
So we've got a few varying questions here. So Beth asks, how can public libraries assist life learning?
Yes, great resources. I think doing what they do. I mean, again, we haven't gathered data on this, but I would see this as very much part of the community. And I think it's breaking out from this idea that lifelong education is about people sitting in classrooms and, the administrative arrangements that are associated with how many people turn up and how many hours they spend sitting on seats. To consider lifelong education more broadly. For instance, the person Shelley I talked about, she actually engaged in two fairly short courses. The first one was to become a beautician and the second one was to become a receptionist. Now, these weren't courses that were offered in the public vocational education system. These were courses that were offered by private providers of very different kinds, by the way. And I think we need to go beyond just the courses and to think about the ways that resources such as libraries and other sources, workplaces, can support that kind of learning. Good point. And I think we should give consideration to the kind of support that can come from places like libraries.
So David asks, are you finding examples of the community aspect or some of it being provided by or augmented by education providers? This seems to be a characteristic of many adult community education providers.
I'm trying to think across of specific examples, because please bear in mind, we're talking about 30 examples here. One of the most clear sources comes from familiars, family, communities. So for instance, Salim was supported very much by the Iranian expatriate community here in Australia, probably in a way that somebody coming from Britain wouldn't be, I suspect. And we know that migrant communities provide a great deal of support. I know there's lots of effort going on in tertiary education institutions to reach out and to engage with workplaces, and I'm sure that plays a key part. I don't think that's come up in any of the 30 interviews that I'm just trying to quickly go through them. What has been very useful in terms of educational support is when credit is given. So Salim, for instance, although he wasn't able to get credit for his undergraduate degree he took in Iran, he sort of did like an apprenticeship for building by working with other people and watching and learning from them. And he was able to get significant credit on the vocational education course offered through TAFE, which led to his licensing as a builder. So what was absent in the higher education provision was available for him in spades, the pun, but in vocational education. And similarly, by the way, just also referring to the experience of Felicia, who had to give up doing her medical science degree to care for her family. Now we probably have the arrangements in place, particularly this year, where she could have studied from home and cared for her children, but that wasn't available at that time. Sorry, I can't answer that question quickly. I'm going through the a lot of the educational experiences were the initial one. Of people moving, into an occupation, and I can't think of an instance at the moment where it was the relation between the tertiary education institution and the community that was particularly helpful. What I can say, by the way, from earlier work I've done on vocational education across Australia, is that kind of partnership and that kind of collaboration is far stronger in regional and rural communities than it is or was in the metropolitan areas. And so that research was done at the turn of the century, so it's probably quite old now, but there was a stronger engagement in communities.
So Deb asks, what are you trying to discover in stage 2?
Well, in stage 2, we're trying to then, having done a retrospective study, we're trying to find out now how and in what ways lifelong education, the provision of experiences to support learning, and lifelong learning come together to promote employability. And I think what's going to be helpful is not just the studies we're going to do with the 30 people, but also the survey to see the ways in which that as people have been displaced from employment, that the education provision in a broad way is able to assist and support people. Bear in mind that when we planned this this project, we imagined there would be a lot of continuity, perhaps more continuity than discontinuity. We would be following through. Now we're faced with a totally different scenario, I think. And when we see discontinuity, significant transitions need to be made. What is being imagined is that the educational provision should become far more important. But what we're realizing is, in a very tight labor market and a difficult circumstance for people individually, personally, how you see yourselves, is that something more is going to be required than just the education. Is that person education plus something we suspect is going to be important.
Jenny asks, what's the role of digital for learning and life/work transitions post-COVID?
Yes, well, it'd be nice if it was post-COVID, but let's hope that's the case. Clearly, this has changed lots of things, the way we go about doing lots of things, working from home, accessing information, being advised by government, being engaged in our community in different ways. I mean, I haven't seen my daughter, who lives in Melbourne, since Christmas, but we Skype regularly and we're able to keep in contact that way. There's going to be changes. I've got another study which is looking at the way that rural general practice has been changed because of COVID, and looking at the way that telehealth is being used, but also looking at the way that a general practice workplace, such as the role of a receptionist, the practice manager, the practice nurse, has changed because of the need to engage with patients more at a greater distance. So we're going to see changes there, and central to that is the use of technology. What's interesting, by the way, from the very initial work in that project in rural general health is it isn't the high level technological interface such as using Skype or Zoom. There we go, we've got something together, Scoop we'll call it. But rather, GPs are saying that they do 99% of their e-consultations using mobile telephones, and that is because everybody knows how to use a mobile telephone. Whereas if you're dealing with an 80-year-old or whatever, they might not have a laptop, they might not have access to Skype or whatever, but they can use a phone. So I think it'll be a question of how these technologies fit in with people's needs and also their readiness to use and engage these technologies.
Well, this question might sort of tie into that one, but Rosemary asks when transitioning or pivoting during COVID from one career to another, does the mode of delivery have an impact on the success of the learning? For example, working in one career while studying online to enter another.
Yes. I think it is. I mean, the bigger transition, I suspect, is going to be people who are not working and are seeking to find new forms of employment, new forms of occupation. And yes, I mean, I suspect that's going to be the greatest challenge for people who have seen their occupations evaporate and are now seeking to find new occupations. And, you know, in a competitive labour market, where some of the options that they might have thought of are inaccessible, I think that will be the key issue. It's great that somebody's got the opportunity to change occupations while they've got a job. And perhaps that's not a job they want. I think perhaps that's the point you're making, that they might have to be working in filling shelves, etc., but they're trying to find new ways forward. And of course, now that universities and I'm sure vocational education institutions have broadly moved on to online provisions, that will be very helpful. But please let's remember, there's an awful lot of learning experiences that can, while there's a lot of experiences that can be provided through online provisions, there's an awful lot that still require engagement in practice, learning by actually engaging the authentic experiences, as well as just through the provision of content and the engagement with content. However interesting and exciting that can be made via electronically mediated educational platforms.
So Jeff asks, the term lifelong learning has been used in a number of education and business institutions. Will your data and outcomes be available for HR professionals to help them understand the concepts and how it can enhance their workforce and support integrated lifelong learning programs with the community, the person and the business? Yes,
I mean, one of the issues that I wasn't raised and haven't raised is that there's a lot of confusion a bit between the term of lifelong learning and lifelong education. Learning is a process that people do. You've got to be able to drink water or coffee to learn. And education is the provision of experiences. And these are two very different things, and often they get conflated within the policy of national governments, but also global agencies such as OECD. So on the one hand, you have the personal trajectory of people, and unlike children who start at school on, whatever it is when they're 5 or 6, even they have a huge range of different experiences. With adults, you've got a huge diversity of experiences and readiness to engage. And I think one of the key factors will be how we can bring about, and this has always been the issue, about how we can bring about effective lifelong educational programs which respect the contributions that the learner can bring, which can engage that experiences and assist them move through and develop secure the kind of outcomes that the educational program is required to achieve. And so that's going to be an issue. It's obviously important for HR specialists. HR specialists have also got the concern of it's a bit different than perhaps the construct of many of vocational education and higher education programs, which tend to be directed towards the achievement of occupational outcomes, whereas workplaces, as we know, understandably, are very concerned about being ready to meet the needs of the particular enterprises. And in some sense, there's a mismatch between government policy. On the one hand, it stipulates very tight occupational standards to be achieved and does that through particular means. And on the other hand, says that people need to be job ready. There's a conflict there, there's a contradiction there that, yes, we want people to be prepared for an occupation, but we also want people to know the variations of occupations that occur that are enacted in workplace, because how an occupation is enacted in workplace A is very different than workplace B, C, D, and E, etc. So there's a process that's probably required to ensure, not ensure, you can't ensure this stuff, is to support the development of learning, which is shaped by an occupational frame, but at the same time is adaptable to the needs of different workplaces. That is, to me, is not an unreasonable goal, because if educational provisions is only about developing the kind of capacities that can be applied in the circumstances of their acquisition, it's failed. What we need is adaptability and the educational processes which open up the provisions. My occupational field way back was clothing design and clothing manufacture. And when I worked in TAFE as a teacher of fashion, would you believe? There's no point in teaching our students specific styles of garments, because by the time they graduated, they'd gone out of fashion. What we had to teach our students was informed principles, so that they could then know how to adapt skirts to make them wider, narrower, to trousers longer, shorter, different kind of impacts. So it's those kind of attributes to promote adaptability which seem to be important for tertiary education, rather than an overly strong focus on nationally consistent occupational outcomes measured through competency standards. But that's entirely another story.
So we've got a couple more questions, and I'm a bit conscious of the time, so we might wrap up after that if no one's got any more. Martin asks, how do you see blended learning as a suitable learning or teaching method in VET?
Very important. I'm doing a project in Singapore now, which is looking at continuing education in Singapore. And essentially people are told they can either learn online or go to the institution. They like a combination of both. They like what both offers them. The online experience where they can access content and do it as and when it suits them, but also, very importantly, the opportunity to engage face-to-face with others, other adults, to share experiences, to try and verify their understandings, etc. And what they're saying is that they don't mind, after a long day's work, going to one of the polytechnics to engage in their CET program. But what they don't want is somebody like me droning on at them for 3 hours. What they want to do is get, have some engagement, have some input, but also have the opportunity to engage with peers who are on the same journey as them at different points, perhaps.
So Deb asks, if possible, could you make a comment if recognition of prior learning features in the Stage 2 study?
Yes, well, that was an aspect that came up. Remember, the first phase was very much exploratory. We're trying to find out what's going on. And this survey we're generating for the second phase will certainly have issues of recognition of prior learning in it. And that will also be an element of following through the interviews, and in particular, the way that not just the RPL process per se, can you get recognition through the RPL process, but more broadly, the way that adults learning and what they've learned and how they can bring that to the adult education provision. It's interesting in Singapore, by the way, that they have a series of diplomas which are very similar to Australia that school leavers largely do for about 2 years duration. But they also have these other diplomas which working age Singaporeans do, which are a lot shorter. They're not required the same study hours as the diplomas that the young school leavers do. That would not sit well within the AQF, because it's saying if it's a diploma, it's X. And the need to be flexible within a framework like AQF to accommodate the needs of working age Australians, particularly in this period, seems to be something which is likely to be important. So I think it's RPL, yes, the granting of credit, but it's also being respectful of these, of adults, and ensuring that their contributions are recognised and they're able to contribute to the educational process as well as their own learning.
I think our last question here is from Sylvia, who asks, how does culture, including class, fit with personal agency, life experience and community support?
Wow. How does, so again, I think it depends how people see themselves in terms of class and culture. Whether people see themselves as being able to aspire to achieve, there's going to be that aspect of subjectivity. Again, just quickly referring back to Singapore, many Singaporeans see themselves as rank and file. And as such, they can't see themselves aspiring to being what's often referred to as leaders in the current narrative. So culture, aspiration, belief, identity. That's why we're focusing on people's subjectivity in the way it can change. And it's just fascinating reading the transcript from Sarah, the woman who, essentially worked in a retail setting and thought that was fine, and her job really was to support her husband. And then she did her course and discovered a feminist perspective and saw herself very, very differently. So I think that's where education can be very important in breaking down some of the constraints that come from societal sentiments. And I think that plays out obviously with gender, with class, with race, indigeneity, etc. So there's, I think, so these are very broad statements I'm making, but I think that they come together, they need to be challenged, and that's the sort of thing I think where that's the way that the educational provision can contribute. I think it's very important to look at what can best support people's learning under what circumstances, and it's those kind of it's those kind of outcomes that are most likely to come from a structured educational experience, where people are asked to question some of the assumptions under which they might have progressed to that point.
Does anyone else have any questions for Stephen? I'll keep an eye on the chat, but I'll take this moment just to thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today and sharing your research with everyone. That was really great presentation and lots of really fantastic questions as well.
Yes.
Perhaps if I have any more, or if anyone follows up afterwards, maybe I could pass them along to you, and just if there are any follow-up. Yep.
Because I've only got a small box here and I can't see many of the questions. So I'll be very happy to try and address the questions if there's any particular issues there. Please feel free to make contact with me or my colleagues. And if you've got any queries, the PowerPoint which you've seen here will be available for you. I will pass that on to the organisers. And yeah, and please feel free to interact. I mean, as you see, all of the members of the research team, we're all about adults learning and development, because that's what we are and who we are. And I'm sure the audience here is no different at all. So the engagement with this community is very important for us. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Stephen. Thanks everyone for coming along today. As Stephen said, I'll be in touch later with some resources through email. So thanks again. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your week and you stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again. Bye.